I'm on my way to Bodie, California. It is an abandoned mining town or ghost town located on the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains, close to the Nevada border. To get there, take Highway 395. You'll get to enjoy the scenic ride as you pass along snow-capped mountains, lakes, and a few rural towns. Bodie was named after a man known as W.S. Bodie from Poughkeepsie, New York. As mining began to decline on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, following the California Gold Rush from 1849 to 1855, prospectors started pushing into the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains, hoping to strike it rich. W.S. Bodie, along with 3 other partners, came here on or about 1859 and discovered gold. Sadly, Bodie's glory was short-lived and he died only a few months later during a winter storm. Little is known about the man himself. Even his actual name has been disputed. Some records have his name listed as Wakeman, William, or Waterman. An original pioneer who was here with Bodie claimed his real name was Wakeman S. Bodie. The final spelling of the town's name, however, was a spelling error from a painter who was making a sign for the town horse stables, and henceforth the place came to be known as Bodie, spelled with an IE at the end instead of an EY. Bodie is now a California registered historical landmark, and it is owned by California's Department of Parks and Recreation. The last Bodie residents left the town in the early 1940s, and the town was left completely abandoned for nearly 20 years until the state purchased the land from the last remaining landowners in Bodie in 1962. So virtually everything you are seeing was just as it was found when the state took over, and has remained that way since. The state describes Bodie as in a state of arrested decay, which basically means they maintain the grounds and do bare minimum repairs, but do zero restoration to the buildings. Many of Bodie's dilapidated structures have been lost to time, and eventually none of these buildings will be here also, which is what makes this place so special. There aren't too many places on earth where you can truly take a step back in time and see it as it was. Depending at what time of the year you come here, the Park Service does offer guided tours, but mostly this is a self-guided excursion. You might notice some numbering the park has placed in front of some of these buildings, and that's because they have neatly organized a guide you can obtain at the entrance, which will give you a brief description on the history of each structure, like families who may have lived there or how the buildings were used. But some buildings are obvious, like the stamp mill, church, and general store. Most of the buildings remain sealed, but this home, known as the Miller House, is left open to allow visitors a first-hand look at what it would have been like inside a house. One of the first things that struck me was how incredibly compact the homes of the past were. I mean, even my last apartment felt like a mansion compared to the scale of this home. And keep in mind, this would have been the home of a more middle-class family. There were many more people who had very meager accommodations, and some who even lived in tents, particularly new arrivals. It was common for families to leave and take only their personal belongings while leaving behind their furnishings. Transportation was difficult in those times, and the terrain to and out of Bodie was pretty rugged, so people would mostly take only what they could pack on mules and horses. But nothing was ever wasted. Often other families would move in and make use of the same furniture. Bodie sits at an elevation of 8,379 feet, and it's one of the things that made life here extremely harsh. There's very limited plant life that can survive at these kinds of altitudes, which is one of the reasons you don't see any trees in the area. They also wouldn't have been able to keep gardens so they could grow their own vegetables, fruits, or grains. The summer temperatures don't typically rise above 80 degrees, but even so, the area is so exposed that it wouldn't have mattered. The winters were exceptionally cold and bitter, and easily the most dangerous time of the year to be out here. Several feet of snow would fall, and there are pictures of snow reaching the roofline, sometimes fully covering entire homes. Another thing that is very much a part of Bodie's history is its reputation for being among the wildest of Wild West boomtowns and frontier violence. If there was ever a place where shootouts, knife fights, gambling, and boozing occurred, it was definitely here. Like many gold rush boomtowns of the era, first came the boom, then came the bust. In the early years after the initial discovery of gold, several corporations quickly moved in and began acquiring claims in the area. Some mining operations were more successful than others, and many went bankrupt after a few short years. In those times, this was a community primarily comprised of working men. It was a town full of roughnecks who worked hard and played hard. There were over 40 saloons and gambling houses, several hotels and boarding houses. There was even a red light district ironically named Virgin Alley and Maiden Lane. Then in 1875, a mine named the Bunker Hill caved in and exposed ore that experts believed could stretch for a few miles. The news of this spread like fire and created a frenzy that brought thousands of people in herds, and Bodie began taking the shape of a functional community. Newer buildings began coming up like the church you saw earlier, family homes, and firehouse. The town reached its peak by the 1880s, and it is estimated that as many as 7,000 to 10,000 people lived here in its heyday. The actual number is hard to know because there were people constantly coming and going, both heartbroken, bankrupt, and disillusioned families, and new arrivals with hopes and dreams of fortune. Bodie was also a very diverse community. Immigrants from all over the world were coming here as well. There was a large Chinese population, and there was even a Chinatown in the north end of town. There was a large Mexican population, many Irish, Canadians, and Native Americans from the various neighboring tribes. As the declining years arrived, people started to see that even though profits were being made by gold being mined here, the town was only large enough to support maybe 1 or 2 mining operations with steady work and revenue. Little by little, smaller operations began shutting down, and people started moving on to greener pastures. The town's population went from thousands to just a few hundred. Mining continued here for another 3 decades. By then, most miners who worked and lived here worked for a daily wage. The most profitable company was the Standard, which mined an estimated $18 million worth of gold and other minerals in a span of 38 years. That's over half of all the gold ever mined here. In total, just over 35 million in gold was mined out of Bodie from all the operations that once ran here combined. Adjusted for today's inflation, that amounts to roughly $784 million, nearly $1 billion. In the town's history, there were 2 major fires that burned nearly the whole town to the ground. One occurred in the 1870s and the last in 1932. During the 32 fire, about 80% of the town burned down, but since it was nearly abandoned by then, there was no point in rebuilding. Thus, this is what is left of a once booming town. wouldn't feel right leaving without paying homage and visiting the residents who once called Bodie home. This is the Bodie Cemetery. I solemnly walk quietly observing some of the gravestones, feeling a great sense of admiration and reverence for the people resting in peace. The Bodie Cemetery is the resting place for many of the town's respectable people who lived and died here. Many of the outlaws and reckless gunfighters who were killed were seldom buried within the confines of the cemetery and were usually buried in unmarked graves in the foothills. Unfortunately, there is an unusually high number of gravestones for young children here. Due to lack of medical attention, many died of very treatable ailments like the flu, the fever. Pneumonia was also a huge killer. I came across the grave of the man himself, W.S. Bodie. I felt honored to be in his presence and obliged to give a moment of silence and a salute from the heart. Hey everyone, so that's going to wrap up today's adventure. That was a lot of fun, and as always, I hope you all enjoyed that, and thank you for coming along. Hopefully this video inspired someone to come out here and check this place out, or if you were already planning on coming out here, maybe you found this useful. Now it's just a long journey home, and I'm just going to enjoy the scenic drive. Until next time, bye-bye.